Okay, our next question here is it reasonable to believe that God exists? It's a little different than our other question. And without knowing anything else, let's say we're not taking any other facts into consideration here. We don't know anything. We're just going to look at it from a very simple, logical, reasonable way. And we can break it down into a couple of possibilities. And so let's look at two here. One is, does God exist? The possibilities are yes or no. So that's two possibilities. And if I follow God, yes or no, right? Is it important to follow God? Yes or no? And does God exist? Yes or no? So that leaves us with four total possibilities. And let's look at them, each one in a little bit of detail to see what makes sense just from a simple logical perspective. Okay. So from our previous question, we looked at eternity. And so if God exists, and the answer is yes to that, then it's very important for us to believe in him. And if he doesn't exist, well, it doesn't really matter, right? If he doesn't exist, you can do whatever you want, and it doesn't really matter. Okay? So let's look at, first of all, let's look at someone who doesn't believe in God. So someone who doesn't believe in God, we may call them as atheist or agnostic, but the term doesn't really matter. Just someone who doesn't believe in God. So what happens at the end of their life? What do they believe happens? And for some people, they believe that, okay, when you die, there's no God, and your body just decomposes into the ground, and that's the end. That's it. And so of our four possibilities, if God does not exist and the atheist is right, then the best case that can happen is that's the end, and it doesn't matter. Now let's look at possibility number two. Let's say the atheist believes there's no God, and there is God. Now, when they die, what's going to happen? And I can tell you that's not a good situation that we want to be in. It would probably be very awkward facing God, not having believed in him your whole life and having to explain that. So really not the outcome we would want. So that's pretty bad. So of those two possibilities, for a non-believer in God, the best thing that can happen is that they die and deteriorate into the ground. And the worst thing that can happen is they face God and really could be in a bad situation. All right. Okay, now let's look at for someone who believes in God. Let's look at the first possibility. Let's say God doesn't exist and the person believes in him. So that person dies. If God doesn't exist, that person just deteriorates into the ground and nothing happens. Okay, but what happens if that person believes in God and God does exist? Well, then it's a really good outcome. It can be in heaven for eternity. And as we spoke of in another question and answer, that eternity is a very long time. And so if you have made a good decision to be with God in heaven for eternity, that can be really good. So for someone who believes in God, the worst thing that can happen is the best that an atheist could ever hope for. If the believer is right, they have so many more benefits in believing in God. So just taking a look at this just from a simple logical perspective, not believing in God doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's really no benefit. Where someone who believes in God, the best thing is they could be in heaven with God. So really, based upon no other information, no other facts, which we are going to get into more in this series, but just based upon no other information and just the logic of it, it makes a whole lot more sense to believe in God. So going back to our question, is it reasonable to believe God exists? I think we've answered that. Yes, it is reasonable to believe God exists. So it's not just fiction or fairy tales. It is a reasonable argument to be made just on that alone. And then we're going to look at some other questions coming up.